Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to Versus Stars podcast. How my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember, click the subscribe button, everybody. It's an amazing episode. Josh Trujillo boards the mothership. He's the writer of Blue Beetle from DC Comics. Now, come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Trujillo. Thank you so much for coming to Versus Stars podcast.
No, of course. Thank you for having me.
Totally my pleasure. So I always start out with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for comics and who are your earliest influences?
Oh, gosh. I've always been into comics, whether it's comic books or comic strips. The big one for me was like the Sunday newspaper strips when I was very young. So like Garfield or Calvin and Hobbes or The Far Side. And so even before I could read, my parents and grandparents were reading those to me. And so I think that's kind of what caught my imagination. But even then, I was tracing over Garfield comic strips and rearranging the panels so that I could get my own stories. And so that's kind of like the earliest inspiration. Obviously, it took about 30 years from then to start working in comics professionally. But that's kind of the beginning of it.
So what caused you to move over to comic books? So you said it's 30 years later. So that's a lot of time in between to be thinking about. So it finally made you go, I'm going to make this happen.
Yeah, for a long time, I didn't know that was an option. You know, you don't really you see people create these stories, TV shows, movies, video games, but you don't really understand how the sausage gets made. I was drawing and doodling my own comics for years, like in junior high and high school, and even a little in college. But the art wasn't very good. I would say the writing was stronger than the art. But out of high school, I got an internship at a publisher, and I learned a little bit about the business of comic books. And I assumed that was going to open some doors for me, and it didn't. I had to get 3 internships before they started to really lead to meaningful connections, I feel like, or meaningful industry connections. But I quickly learned that no one's going to pay me to do comics until I make comics. So that meant saving up my money. I'd save my paycheck to pay an artist for 1 page. So every 2 weeks, I would get 1 page of art done. And I had to do this 30 times. So like I spent over a year just saving up to make my first comic book. And then you have to save money for printing it and going to conventions and all this other stuff. So that was really stressful for me. But ultimately, you kind of build up your own little catalog of work. And that's something you can proudly show editors or artists and kind of get their buy-in and start to believe in you as a creator alongside you believing in yourself as a creator.
So how long when you were doing this as on the indie level, how long did it take for you to start reaching profitability with your comic books?
I've never reached profitability on an indie work.
Join the club.
No, it's a labor of love. Even the most successful Kickstarters, you're lucky to kind of break even sometimes, or maybe I'm just bad. I have a bad business sense, but I consider it all like an investment. It pays off in tangible and intangible ways. I get work from doing these indie books. Real publishers, quote unquote, see me and they're like, "Oh wow, Josh can deliver." You know what I mean? He can make a successful book. I want to work with that guy. And so also like I get to work with artists or work on stories that I never would be able to do at Marvel or DC or anything like that. So like my first series, was called Love Machines, and it was kind of about technology and romance and how they kind of affect each other throughout history. And that's kind of a tall order. You're not going to see Image publish a book like that from a no-name creator. And so like my Pool Boys comic I just did with Josh Cornione, and that's leading to some more mainstream work for the both of us. So the short answer is I've never broken even on an independent work, but the long answer is I feel like I've gotten my reward. I got what I wanted back.
That's funny. And the Love Machine sounds very fascinating. It sounds like it, like I said, it had to be indie because there doesn't seem to be that specific built-in audience for that book. I mean, I doubt you're doing a naughty version of Love Machines when you were doing it. So how did you convince yourself to keep plugging away when you were not hitting your profit? Because like I do my own indie books right now, and I'll tell you right now, profitability not there. I mean, I can break even now because of Kickstarter, but it's not profitability. So how does that confidence keep going for you, or how did it keep going for you to say, this is going to pay off in the end?
I was working in restaurants and working in the service industry for about 10 years after high school. So I waited tables, I bartended, I managed restaurants, and I hated it, man. I kind of look back on it a little with nostalgia now, but at the time I was miserable, I was starving, and I was just not
Mm,
getting the shifts I wanted to make the money. And I realized pretty quickly that if I didn't make a big move for myself, I was going to have a midlife crisis and then do
mm,
it. So I was like, either I have my breakdown now in my mid to late 20s, or I do it in 15 years. So that's kind of what kept me going. It was this like it's now or not, it's now or nothing, right?
mm,
And more importantly than that, the validation I got from every time there was a new page coming in of art or a new issue being getting coming out or uploading my PDFs on Comixology, like that was all like a huge thrill for me. And like I was riding a high even though I was losing hundreds of dollars left and right.
yeah.
And so like I'm really grateful that like it's not necessarily easy to self-fund some of these books. We have Kickstarter and Indiegogo now, so that helps a little bit if you can develop an
Mm.
audience. But I was doing this to please myself and keep my own demons at bay. And so I hope that there's that. It's art, right? It's the truest form of art. Is like you're creating what you want to see in the world. And
Mm.
I would say just you got to keep doing that, and people find it.
And someone like I said in the indie world, what I find the most challenging is marketing, and I think there's a lot of people forg who try to resist the idea that an artist is also a publicist or marketer. You can't be one or the other if you're going to be in the indie world. I mean, if you work for DC or Marvel, DC can will promote your stuff because it's on their brand. But when you're on your own, you can't do that. So how difficult was it to become a marketer for your own work?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges in indie comics, right? Is trying to get eyeballs on the thing.
Mm,
But for me, that meant a lot of like, oh gosh, finding any comics blog I could, offering to send them a PDF, or like, I still use Twitter to promote my work, but obviously there's been a big drop off in terms of people using it.
yeah.
Uh, so the challenge I think for people, whether that be through TikTok or whether just going back to Facebook or Instagram or whatever, like find those audiences that you can tap into, and more importantly, like find fellow creators and fellow readers, because you're all kind of it's you inspire each other in some way. There's this healthy competition and this like knowledge that you can share. Like I didn't know which printer to go
Mm,
for my indie comics, but I had friends who were like, "Oh, I've tried that printer. Don't go there. Go to this one instead. They'll give you a better deal, or the paper quality's better, or whatever." And so a big power I have now is I feel like I've built this kind of community of creators around me, and we can rely on each other for that like insider knowledge, I guess.
so now you're the writer of Blue Beetle from DC Comic Books. Um, Having developed a indie audience, a network, how easy has it been to bring them over to your work on on books like DC's Blue Beetle?
I think the jury's still out on that one a little bit. I think the Graduation Day miniseries did really well for DC by whatever metric they have. I try not to ask what the sales numbers are because I will lose sleep. Uh, it did well enough that we're an ongoing series these days, and I get they're interested in pursuing other works with me, and Marvel calls me back every so often. So I hope that means the audience has followed me from my indie
Mm,
work to my mainstream work. But the truth is, I do a lot of different stuff. Some creators are the horror guy, right? And they just do horror and they do it really well. But for me, I get a little distracted. I like doing superhero stuff. I like doing nonfiction, history comics. I like doing romance comics. And so really for me, it's like, what's catching my attention now? And I think hopefully people start to look at a book and not be like, oh, it's a robot book. I don't want to pick that up. I hope they look at it and it's like, oh, I know Josh. He did that pirate book, but I
mm,
want to see what he does with a robot book or whatever it is.
mm. I mean, your timing for Blue Beetle couldn't be better. I mean, it was recently released as a movie in a movie. Um, High profile, not high profile, it's still a film.
Mhm.
So because it's been a film, and obviously, regardless of character, for the most part, the films are always going to be higher profile than the comics.
Sure.
how did that being a film impact your approach to making it a comic book? And was there anything editorially that you were told you had to do this or didn't or not do this because of the impact of the film?
We weren't given like any hard rules, but we were told a couple of things about the movie. I didn't know the plot of the movie, for example. I didn't know what happened in it, but they did tell me that like Ted Kord, who is the second Blue Beetle, Jaime Reyes, the star of the movie, is the third Blue Beetle. They're like, we're going to introduce Ted's sister in the movie. She doesn't exist in the comics. Would you be interested in bringing her over into the comics? And I was like, you know, Ted Kord doesn't have a very large cast of characters around him. I thought this would be really good for Ted and good for Jaime because there's an interesting dynamic that we play with in the book. But and then also we learned that in the movie that we were going to take Jaime out of his El Paso roots and move him to this new city, kind of a metropolis of sorts, kind of called Palmera City. And so we didn't really know what to expect from Palmera City either. We just knew it was a new city. It was a big city.
Mm.
And so my artist, Adrian Gutierrez, and I, we really kind of had to think, what kind of architecture is there? What are the communities like? What is the tension within that city? And so we really spent a lot of time going back and forth on it. And we ended up with something really a lot like the movie, which is fun. It's kind of like just a coincidental thing. But great minds think alike, I guess. We thought, what would a modern city look like in the DC universe that isn't Gotham, isn't Metropolis, something that has kind of like a unique flavor, it has a little diversity to it, it has a lot of character. And so that's what we're hoping to create with this Palmera City, is that it's a lasting, permanent addition to the DC universe that you'll see just as often as you will the other big cities or Paradise Island or whatever.
Now, when you're talking about cities, in the world of DC, what I tend to hear is that Metropolis represents New York, even though New York doesn't exist in the DC universe as well. I mean, I know Firestorm for a little while I think it was supposed to be New
It's
York.
always a little confusing, isn't it?
Right, and Gotham was supposed to be in New Jersey somewhere. That's my understanding. I guess Bloodhaven, I don't know, is Delaware. I don't know, but either way, it's somewhere in that area. So when you're thinking of Palmero City, what city are you thinking about as being this is the real life out of version of Palmero City in DC?
Yeah, so I think of it kind of like a Silicon Valley
Mm.
on the Gulf Coast. So, Silicon Valley isn't really filled with skyscrapers and stuff, but you could imagine it, right? In your head, you think of these like towering skyscrapers and it's high-tech projections everywhere and flying cars. And so that was kind of my idea. Is like I was inspired by Austin, which is like it's been the fastest growing city in the country for 10 years straight.
Oh, wow.
And so what happens if you keep like what are the pressures of a city that keeps growing up and keeps growing out? And what does that mean for the people who've been there the longest? And so we have this kind of tension between the main Palmera City, the hub of it, and more like the Keys, the outskirts of Palmera City, where the communities are, where the culture is, where the history is. And so that was kind of my thinking. It's somewhere between Florida and Texas is my thought. But in the movie, it's a lot like Miami. And then I was talking to Adrian the other day, and he told me that he was inspired by like Shanghai and Singapore. And so I was like, that's really interesting. So it is kind of this hybrid of like futuristic, modern Asian cities with a little bit of El Paso in there, right?
That's cool. That sounds awesome. Now, the other thing that you mentioned is that Jaime Reyes is the third Blue Beetle. There's Dan Garrett, Ted Kord, Jaime Reyes. Now, for a character that's been around more or less since the 40s, there's very little known in public consciousness about these Dan Garrett and Ted Kord. Like my memory of Ted Kord is always, let's see, it would be Blue Beetle, kind of like Booster. I think Booster Gold is always when I envision him with Justice League from the 80s with the late Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis. And the fact that he got killed by Maxwell Lord. That seems like the only thing I really know about the guy, and that he has a lot of money. Dan Garrett, even less. So how do you build continuity around these characters when the public consciousness knows very little about their actual comic book origins?
No, I think that's a really good question. And it's something I grapple with a little bit, right? Is like, the legacy of Blue Beetle is so central to Jaime's story. You
Mm,
know, he's following in the footsteps of these great heroes, but the readers probably haven't read a Ted Kord comic, and they've definitely never read a Dan Garrett comic. The
right.
last of those came out in like 63 or something, and that was like a rehash of the older comics. So
Yep.
like they don't know, they don't have a relationship with Dan, they don't have a relationship with Ted necessarily. So I think the challenge is like, why does this history matter to Jaime? And in this new storyline, we pull a villain from the original Dan Garrett Blue Beetle comic, and we kind of throw him against Jaime in an unexpected way. And so for me, it's like that's what the catch is for me. This story, Dan Garrett matters because Jaime is wearing the Blue Beetle insignia. He has the scarab, and the scarab has a lot of history behind him and a lot of enemies. And so you got to learn your history real quick before it catches up to you.
Now, once again, I've been a fan of DC comic books for like 30 something years. However, I will admit I know the Scarab as far as Jaime Reyes. I don't know of the Scarab with Dan Garrett and Ted Kord in the comic books. Did they have a Scarab history back in the day? And how have you kind of retro connected the Scarab history with them?
Yeah, so it's what's the quickest way to say this? It's a comic book, so it's messy. But Dan Garrett was an archaeologist. He found what was then thought of as a magic scarab beetle. He wore it as a belt, and it gave him super strength and all these weird powers. He died, and he passed on the scarab to Ted, but the scarab didn't work for Ted. So Ted just had to rely on technology and gadgets and things like that. Kind of like the character Night Owl from Watchmen is directly
Mm.
inspired by Ted Kord. And so he had to rely on tech. And then the Scarab found Jaime and kind of exhibited all these powers and abilities that we'd never seen from the Scarab before. So it kind of skips a generation to go from Dan Garrett over to Jaime. But now we know much more about the Scarab, which is named Kajida. It's an alien technology. It's a sentient being. It has emotions. It has empathy, and it learned a lot of this from Dan Garrett as well as Jaime. And they're kind of like, Jaime's teaching Kajida how to be a hero, and Kajida's teaching Jaime how to not destroy the universe with this weapon he has on his back.
Now, in the original comics of Ted Kord and Dan Garrett, did that Scarab exist in their actual continuities, or that's added on by you to kind of like make it cohesive?
Okay, so yes and no.
Okay.
But Dan Garrett did have the scarab. It was magic, unquote, and it served him well until he died. The what I add is that we never know how Ted Kord got the scarab.
Okay.
In the comics, in the mainline continuity, Ted has the scarab in the 80s, but we don't see how he got it. And so there's a little panel in issue 1 on page 1 of the new Blue Beetle series that I wrote, where Dan is handing the scarab to Ted, and that's the only real retcon in the ongoing series right now, is that I had to figure out how did he get that scarab, because it's very important. It's kind of the whole deal.
Right.
And so that's what on his in his dying last effort he gives it to Ted.
That's awesome. Now, one interesting thing as well with what you're doing with Jaime is that for people like me, my memory of Jaime going back is that his appearances in The Young Justice, his appearances on as a teenager, as a teen. I think he was also in Teen Titans or something like that for a little while. Is as basically one of the rookie heroes. Again, echoed also in the movie as a rookie hero. However, in this series, he's taken on a mentor role to Dynastus and Nitida. So how are you demonstrating a maturity of Jaime by having him move from kind of like the rookie hero to now reaching a mentor stage?
It is a little tricky, right? Because it's one of those things that like there are like 5 Robins now, and it's like he must have been Robin for like 6 months before.
Right.
So there's that sliding timeline you got to play with. But the main thing was, Jaime had spent the past 15 years as kind of the rookie hero and living in El Paso and kind of dealing with problems there. And we saw an opportunity to really kind of upgrade Jaime, to give him more prominence. If you've played like the Injustice video games, he's prominent in them. You mentioned Young Justice, which has a great storyline around Jaime's villains, the Reach. But like, I think the challenge there is like, how do you translate a young hero to an adult hero? Jaime's not there yet. He's still on his journey, but I wanted to give him some stakes. The idea of giving him a new city to protect, a more adult situations, and also a team of heroes that he has to look out for once. He's been on the Teen Titans, but he's never led the Teen Titans. He's been on the Justice League, but he's never led the Justice League. Now he's got Team Beetle. We'll come up with a better name for it at some point, but he's got Team Beetle. And what happens when you're kind of confronted? It's good that Jaime's not alone for the first time. He's not the only scarab wielder, but also like now he has this responsibility and he has to teach himself how to grow up.
Now, one thing about the big two, DC and Marvel, is that they often shy away from character growth. You know what I'm saying? Like what it works at the beginning of the character, they want to like keep him. That's why Spider-Man has often been a teenager for decades, because it's just, what I'm saying? I mean, once in a while they grown him up, once in a while, but they always end up pushing him back to being back in high school or college, because it's just, that's where the character has been known from. So how difficult is it, or how difficult was it to convince DC to grow up the character, walk away from being part of this character being new, learning how to be, a hero, to now, as we discussed, being a good enough of a hero, or at least experienced enough to feel like he can mentor these others?
Yeah, one of my earliest conversations with my editor, Andrew Marino, was kind of about this topic, was the idea that, in graduation day, Jaime graduates from high school, and there's a risk to that, right? Because once you do that, you can't go back and tell more high school stories with Jaime.
Right. And
we had to really think about, like, it's not that there are more stories to tell someday. There might be Blue Beetle, the Lost Years or whatever, but like, we wanted to look forward, and like, we didn't want to do any rehashes. We wanted new characters, new villains, a new city. And so it was an easy choice for us. And I'm also not saying that he'll never go back to El Paso. I always think of it like Palmera City is kind of Jaime's metropolis, and El Paso is kind of Jaime's Smallville. Although El Paso has like 250,000 people there, so it's definitely not Smallville.
Right.
But he can always go back home, and he will. But right now we're looking ahead, and DC has like been nothing but supportive about it.
Now, as you're kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like you're kind of writing the bridge years of Jaime. He's no longer the rookie. He's not the hardened veteran. You're still kind of writing him a little bit at that bridge point where he's turning into the more veteran hero, even though he is a mentor. Which areas are you still writing for him as far as in need of growth? Because obviously he's not where he has to be. He's in that middle range. So how have you kind of decided which part you still want to hold back as saying he needs to develop these areas of his character?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this miniseries, or not, I keep calling it minis, this arc we're doing, the Blood Scarab storyline, is kind of about like learning to step up and be a leader. And also it's about, being a leader is like calling the shots sometimes, but being the leader is also being selfless in some way, right? It's knowing when you have to step up instead of your team. And so this is a real challenge that Jaime is facing, is like, does he bring in these people to this dangerous situation, or does he try to lead by himself? And I think that's really the struggle that he's going through in fighting the Blood Scarab, because it's a foe that he's never encountered before, with these incredible powers that are, I don't know if you read the first issue, but he's a serious threat. So, that's kind of the big thing. But there's also a lot of like, I want him to be less naive. I want him to be a little more confident. But also, you can never be too confident in the DC universe, because one day you're fighting space aliens, the next day you're fighting the wrath of God. You know what I mean?
Now,
keep throwing weird stuff at him, and he'll always be, there's always something to surprise him.
Now, one interesting part in issue 2, there was a scene in a diner where characters from the Rise are getting kind of bullied, as it were, or very much is people just demonstrated hatred towards the Horizon Mother in this diner. Kind of experienced maybe a lot of immigrants have felt when they entered a new country where this is unnecessary hatred just had been like flooded at them. And issue 2, remember there's indication that Horizon's patience with humanity may not last forever. Is there an end to their patience that they're going to have with humanity? And where does this leave the Beatles and their loyalty if the Horizons kind of decided they're just not going to get along with humans and that's just how it goes?
I mean, I think that's the great question we're asking here, right? Is like, I would say wait and see, but no, I wanted to, I don't like to beat people over the head with things, but I tried to look at the situation. What would happen if all these space aliens suddenly came to Earth? And I'm looking at like great sci-fi, like is it District 9?
Yep,
And
District 9, yep.
District 9, or even Alien Nation is
Oh,
something
that's a good one.
and so you kind of think about these like alien communities, literally aliens, space aliens, coming to Earth and trying to live among us and the difficulties with that. And there are some parallels, obviously, with the immigrant experience, and that's very relevant to Latino communities, Hispanic communities, all sorts of communities. And so I didn't want to shy away from that necessarily. And also, I like giving Jaime problems he can't punch. You know, he has the biggest, most powerful weapon in the DC universe attached to his spine. There's not a fight he can lose, really, in a lot of ways. But one thing he can lose is kind of he can lose his humanity, he can lose his empathy, and he can lose his community. So that's something he needs to protect as well. And how do you kind of, what does assimilation even look like? And on the other part of your question, you know, the Horizon came to Earth kind of hoping it would be a refuge for them, and they're already facing big hostilities, not just from that kind of issue 1, but also in issue 2 when the blood scarab goes up against them. And so I do think they're kind of getting their patience tested, and we're seeing a lot of that through not just the leader of the Horizon, Shepherd Ood, but Uli, who's one of the new characters we introduced in the series. She's the daughter of the Shepherd Ood, and really is kind of our mouthpiece for what the Horizon are going through.
Now, Dynastis and Natida, I'm looking at the names wrong. I do apologize. Talk about having to reconcile with the Beatles in order to work together. So ultimately, are the Beatles loyal to the host? Are they loyal more to the Horizon? Are they loyal to the planet that they're on right now? When it push comes to shove, where's their loyalty going to lie if the Horizon gets sick of the situation?
I mean, you're asking all the right questions, right? That's another wait and see. But I will say that, you know, we talk a little bit about an issue 2, and we'll follow up on it later on. But Dynastis and Natida have very different relationships with their superpowers, with their new role as being protectors of the Horizon. Dynastis is very community oriented, very selfless, and Natida did not ask for this at all. You know what I mean? Like, I'm interested. There's so many characters that it's like, you are Shazam, you are the chosen one, and like, maybe you don't want to be the chosen one. How do you grapple with that where your old life is gone? You know, this is something we see kind of in with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It comes up a little bit too, that reluctant hero. And so I like kind of pairing them off against each other, someone who's head first willing to be a protector of the Horizon and their community, and maybe someone who's a little more selfish, maybe someone who has their own needs and don't want to sacrifice all that for these aliens who kind of chose them.
So why does the Scarabs choose who they choose?
You know, that's a good question. I think for Jaime, Hachida saw something of maybe a kindred spirit, or maybe someone they could manipulate easily because he was a young teenager at the time. Dynastis and Natida, I think Dynastis was looking for that personal strength of character and maybe even physical strength. We haven't shown, but Xiaomar is the host of the Dynastis Beetle, and you know she's built like a weightlifter, and so it kind of exemplifies that strength. And then for Roma, our Natida, I don't know why she got chosen necessarily, and I think she doesn't know why she got chosen. That's a big character storyline that we're kind of digging into. She was a little underserved in Graduation Day, but I can assure you that I'm not going to shut up about her coming up.
So the Blood Scarab is a very cool looking villain. ass kicking villain. Like I said, the first issue, he beats the living shit out of Ted Kord. It's not really that close of a fight. He refers to Dynasis and Nitida as imitators.
Mhm.
Um, how does he view the Blue Beetle Scarab differently than if those two are imitators? And he seems to be taking the Blue Beetle Scarab way more seriously. So why are they imitators and not him?
Yeah, so Dynasis and Atida, those beetles were created by the Horizon. And the Horizon, as you know, because you read it, are an offshoot of the Reach. Basically, they're I wouldn't call them pacifist, but they were opposed to conquest that the Reach are known for. The Reach are conquerors, and the Horizon did not want to do that, so they fled.
Hmm.
But they still have the capacity to build these weapons of their own. And so the Blood Scarab has a unique interest in Kajida, Jaime Scarab specifically, and that kind of ties back to the Dan Garrett days as well. So that's kind of what I'm getting at there. There's something that Kajida has that the Blood Scarab wants more than anything.
Hmm.
And Nativa and Dynasis are just, and even Ted Kord are kind of obstacles just getting in the way.
Hmm. But
The Blood Scarab's kind of trying to clear the playing field so they can get at Jaime when he's most vulnerable.
but he's such a badass looking character. I mean, how much of the fun is it to write a character who basically is beating the crap out of everyone in his path?
Oh, it's so fun. We don't shy away from our inspirations, very much like Dragon Ball Z and classic manga. But it's fun because in Graduation Day, the miniseries, we talked a lot about Jaime's insecurities and his fears were really the foe, right?
Hmm.
We thought the Reach were coming and we were going to have this fantastic space battle, but in reality, it was the Horizon who showed up. They were more refugees than conquerors. And so for this storyline, it's so fun to just have a villain that wants to punch and kick and stab. And I think people are going to get the action maybe they were craving for Graduation Day.
Now, once again, you're saying this is an ongoing series. How far along is the plot? How many issues are we guaranteed before DC get? I mean, it's from DC because I know DC gets nowadays. Series always get twitchy about new series. So, I mean, are we guaranteed the next 12 issues, 20 issues, 30 issues? How far along has DC pretty much guaranteed us?
I can't give you a magic number. I'm always waiting for that too. I can tell you that I have the next storyline plotted out. I can't say how many issues that is, but it's we're once Scarab War is over, there is at least some more Jaime Reyes coming. I haven't told anyone actually, so this is breaking news.
Oh, very cool! Hey, exclusive for me. I mean, I kind of feel like nowadays the time of the 100th issue of whatever title is more old fashioned. You know what I'm saying? There's not a whole lot that goes to 100, but it'd be great to have 50 issues of Blue Beetle, 80, 75 issues of Blue Beetle. I mean, can you just give us like a nod and be like, yeah, this is happening?
Oh my God, I would love that. These things it comes down to numbers, right? But these it seems like comics they like to reboot, not necessarily
Yes.
reboot continuity, but reboot the numbering or whatever every so often. So I'll write 5 Blue Beetle #1s if it means we get to keep doing the book. That's kind of my formal opinion. My dream would be to do an Ultimate Spider-Man style run of just 100 issues, whatever, 148, I think it is, or something like that. Like to really dig into these characters and really show people what they've got. It's so frustrating sometimes. A lot of when you start doing these superhero comics, they ask you to do like 4-page backups, 8-page backups, 12-page backups, and it's never enough story to really get into the heart of the character. Sometimes you get lucky, or sometimes you really have a good angle on it. But like just to have 6 issues with Jaime, I was like, oh, I'm addicted. I got to do more. And now we're doing an ongoing,
Right.
and it's really exciting to focus not just on him, but also build up the supporting cast that I hope stays with them long after I'm off the book.
So, what can we just look forward to future issues of the Blue Beetle?
Big action, big stakes, new villains, maybe some romance heading in Jaime's future, a lot more Dynasis and Natida. Don't worry, Ted will get better, but that doesn't necessarily mean things will get better.
Are we looking at potentially more Scarabs showing up? Like how big will this team beetle scarab become?
There are a lot of colors in the crayon box, but wait and see, I'll say. I've got some foes that are not beetles that will be coming up against Jaime very soon.
Very cool. Mr. Trujillo, thank you so much for coming on the Traverse the Stars podcast. You've been awesome.
That was a blast. Thank you for having me.
No problem.